Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, The Principles of the Belmont Report and the Ethics of Human Research. Today's webinar will be presented by Dr. Ivor Pritchard, who is the Senior Advisor to the Director of OHRP in the Office for Human Research Protections in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. He came to OHRP in 2004 from the Institute for Education Sciences at the U.S. Department of Education, where he was a Senior Research Analyst. He joined the U.S. Department of Education in 1986. He has a PhD in philosophy from Boston University, and his research interests are in research ethics and federal policy and moral education research and practice. Please leave all your questions till the end for the Q&A, and these slides and recording will be available on our past events section on our website. Thank you. Ivor?
Thank you, Zena, and welcome everybody. I wish that I could see you all so that I could have an idea of whether I'm managing to hold on to your attention, but I'm going to be optimistic and hope that that's what's happening, and maybe at the end when we get some questions, that will give me some feedback as to whether anybody was listening to what I had to say or not. So here's the title of my talk. And I want to say a couple of things about the scope of the talk. I'm going to be talking first about the principles of the Belmont Report themselves and where they came from. And then I'm going to be talking about some other ethical issues that come into play when applying the Belmont principles in the ethics of in human research studies. I am not going to be talking about the entire field of research ethics. There are some things that I'm not going to touch upon. For example, there are some moral virtues which I would argue are integral to the practice of ethical research, but I'm not going to be talking about those at all today. So, trying to get the slides to advance, and that's not happening. So I'll try a different way. No. Yeah, that's what I used. Okay. Technical glitches. Here's my the standard disclaimer. I do have a conflict because I work for the Office for Human Research Protection, so I have an interest in supporting people's paying attention to those regulations. And I'm going to be talking almost entirely about ethical issues about which there might be disagreement within our office, and hardly at all about the regulations. This is really not a talk about the official policy of the department. Particularly since I'm going to be talking about a number of different social issues. I know that there are some people who are particularly interested in the perspective of the speaker. And so I'm going to give you some information about who I am so that you can take that into account in making judgments about what I say. So let's first start with where the Belmont principles come from. In 1972, a woman named Jean Heller published a story in the New York Times exposing to the public the story of a research study that had been going on for the last 40 years by the U.S. Public Health Service in Alabama. A study for which there were numerous research reports written in the scientific literature. So it was not secret information, but it was information that was not well known to the public. It was a study of 400 men with untreated syphilis, and during the time of the study in the 1940s, so 10 years after the study began, an effective treatment for syphilis was discovered, but was not made available to the subjects. In fact, there were deliberate efforts to make sure that the subjects did not get effective treatment by the researchers. This became a real scandal. In the year after 1972, when the story was published in the New York Times, Senator Kennedy held a series of hearings about human experimentation in which they paid attention both to this study and a number of other activities, including such things as the sterilization of Black women without their consent when they went into the hospital for one procedure and discovered afterward that they had been sterilized. But this story in particular goaded the Congress to take action. And in 1974, the National Research Act was passed. And one of the things in the National Research Act was the creation of a commission to study the problems of human subjects research in biomedical and behavioral research. And they were commissioned to identify the basic ethical principles which should underlie the conduct of research involving human subjects. And furthermore, the National Research Act said that the commission should look at the role of assessment of risk-benefit criteria, guidelines for the selection of human subjects, and the nature and definition of informed consent in various research settings. And so the commission did its deliberations, and 4 years later, they came up with the principles of the Belmont Report, which were respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. And as you can probably see, those principles line up pretty closely with those three provisions that the commission was instructed by the National Research Act that they needed to pay attention to. But the commission did not invent these three principles. They took them from three different philosophical traditions in the history of Western philosophy. And it's important to understand something about the differences between the ethical traditions that they took these principles from in order to understand the meaning of those principles themselves. So the respect for persons principle clearly comes from the work of a German philosopher by the name of Immanuel Kant, who's described the first principle of his moral theory as the categorical imperative of treating every rational being as a free rational agent and as ends in themselves. Kant thought that what made morality distinct was that people have the ability to choose what they do, what their action is, based upon reasons. And it is this capacity for free choice of actions that makes them special. And that it is the exercise of those decisions that they should be held accountable for, and that they also ought to because they are themselves people who can make those decisions, they should show the same consideration to every other rational being in deciding what to do. Now, what kind of challenges does this approach to moral philosophy involve? A classical problem that is posed for this perspective in ethics is the scenario where the Nazis come to your door and you have been hiding a Jewish family to try and keep them safe, and the Nazis ask you, are you hiding any Jews? Now, the question is, would you lie or would you tell the truth? And if you take Kant's philosophical view strictly, the answer would be that you would tell the truth. Why? Because if you lied to the Nazis, you would be taking away from them the ability to make a free choice about how they ought to behave toward the Jews. And so you should leave it up. You may try to persuade them what they ought to do, but you should not keep them from being able to make a decision about what the right thing to do is. So in the Belmont Report, the notion of respect for persons is described as this idea that subjects are autonomous beings. They can decide for themselves generally. And in the case of subjects with limited autonomy, like children or people who are temporarily impaired, to make sure that they are protected until they reach the point where they can be autonomous beings again. And as you can see in the description of the applications, this lines up quite nicely with that notion of informed consent, which was one of the provisions in the National Research Act. And just as a reminder in passing, this notion of informed consent is also reflected plainly in provisions in the regulations for the protection of human subjects in research. So the second ethical principle is the principle of beneficence. And one of the leading exponents of beneficence was Jeremy Bentham, an 18th century English philosopher, who called his philosophical view utilitarianism. And the leading principle, which beneficence resembles, is the notion of the greatest happiness of the greatest number. So here in this vision of ethics, it's not the intention that's important particularly, it's the consequences. The results of what happens are what we do in evaluating whether a particular action was the best action to be taken. And what we want to do is we want to maximize the value of anything that we do. And Bentham was applied this view to himself, even beyond his deathbed. This is a photograph of what is left of Bentham's body, which sits in a glass box at the University College of London. According to his will, Bentham first had them donate his corpse to a local medical college so the medical students could study anatomy. And then when they were finished doing the studying of his body in the class, he then had them sew him back up and put him here at the University College of London so that he could remind the board members of the University College that they should make decisions for the University College on the basis of utilitarian considerations. So what is one of the classic challenges to utilitarianism? This is a painting by Géricault of an early 19th century event in which a ship hit a sandbar and went aground and started to sink, and there were not enough lifeboats. So the carpenter built a small raft, and some people were put on that raft, but there were more people on the raft than the raft could hold. And so people fought in order to stay on the raft. There were originally about 150 people on the raft, and by the time they were rescued, there were only 15 left alive. So the question would be for the utilitarian, if you're on a raft and you think that the raft is going to go down with all of the people that are on it, do you throw somebody overboard or do you all go down together? The utilitarian would say you throw someone overboard because it would be better to have some people survive than it would be to have all of them die. And so you ought to go ahead and deliberately kill some people. And the decision about who to throw overboard might also involve utilitarian considerations. If somebody is extremely heavy, you might throw them early in the process because you could save more people by throwing the heavier people overboard. If you've got a physician, on the other hand, you might not throw them overboard because they might be able to help others survive. If you have somebody who's relatively old, like me, who's not going to live much longer anyway, you might throw me overboard relatively early in the process. So let me identify a couple of other issues that are sort of internal to how you understand the principle of beneficence that you have to make decisions about in order to apply this principle of beneficence. So the first is, you have to ask the question, are all kinds of benefits and harms of equal value, or are there some kinds of benefits and harms that are preferable over others? And the utilitarian philosophers themselves were divided about this question. Bentham thought that everything, so long as it was a comparable amount, any kind of benefit was just as good as any other, right? Wealth versus health versus beauty, right? An equal amount of each one of those ought to have the same value. Whereas one of his leading students, John Stuart Mill, thought that there are some kinds of benefits that have greater social value than others, and so they should be weighted in the utilitarian calculus. Likewise, there's the question of, when we're talking about achieving the greatest happiness of all, who counts as all, right? Is it just the people who are already alive, right? Or should you be taking future individuals into consideration in deciding how to achieve the greatest happiness of the greatest number? Two things particularly relevant maybe to understanding the situation of research, which is that in an important way, human subjects research represents a key predicament of utilitarianism, which is the notion that it is possible to sacrifice the interest of some people for the sake of others. And it's also the case, particularly when we look at here, the Belmont Report identifies the notion of maximizing benefits and minimizing possible harms. And there, again, we see that National Research Act provision echoed in the applications of the principle of beneficence in the Belmont Report. Clearly, many research studies are designed where the risks occur now during the conduct of the research, but the justification for doing the research are the benefits which may accrue both to people who are already alive, who receive the treatment which turns out to be successful on the basis of the research evidence, but also later generations of people who can also benefit. And again, here's the regulatory criterion, one of them pertaining to risk. And here is the second that pertains to balancing risks and anticipated benefits that's in our regulations. And then we come to the third principle of justice, which we have to go all the way back to before the Common Era to see Aristotle, an ancient Greek philosopher who was one of the first philosophers to talk about the principle of distributive justice in distributing goods, rights, burdens, etc., according to what people deserve. And Aristotle, too, had a different conception of what moral philosophy should be about. His view was based very much on a notion of a community of people who had agreed on a specific set and hierarchy of social goods and practices, which they all had agreed that they ought to support. So here's a classic ethical problem for the principle of the distribution of justice, which is that there are several different ways to distribute goods, rights, benefits, etc. And of course, for any one which you choose, if you choose to make the distribution on the basis of one of them, you are effectively rejecting the value of the claim that some other method of distribution is as good or better. So think about what we did with the COVID vaccine. We did not, even though we often, as a kind of default, tend to say, well, we should treat people equally, right? We did not treat people equally when we had the scarce resource of the COVID vaccine. What we actually did was we gave preference to items B and D here. We gave the vaccine first to people, to old people like me who were most vulnerable, and D, we gave them to healthcare workers because we wanted to make sure that they didn't get sick because they were the front line, if you will, in battling the pandemic. And here is the Belmont Report's identification of what the principle of justice is about, of distributing burdens and benefits equitably, and of not exploiting vulnerable populations, and its applications that you should select individuals and classes of subjects equitably and link burdens to benefits. And by now, I think you can probably appreciate the way in which the National Research Act and the Belmont Report were also clearly a response to the US study of untreated syphilis in Black men. That study did not get informed consent. Subjects were told they had bad blood, but they were misled about the nature of the study. There was clearly discrimination in the selection of the subjects, and there was a clear ignorance of providing a benefit to the subject in penicillin that became available to the study. So on the basis of all three of those principles, the US study failed. And here is the regulatory criterion that pertains to selection of subjects in our regulations. And now I would imagine that virtually everybody, particularly the Americans in the audience, ought to be thinking, well, all of this seems pretty familiar to me. You know, people talk about respect. People talk about doing good. People talk about being fair. This is not a complete surprise. And of course, the explanation for that is that these three values are indeed embedded in the values of our American ideology. We are the inheritors of the ideas of Aristotle and Kant and Bentham. And you can see how, you know, the American Declaration of Independence expression of these values as being equality, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness pretty much follow the notions of justice, respect, and beneficence. So we all have these Belmont principles sort of in our blood, if you will, or our bones. So now let me tell you what I'm going to be doing for the next half hour, which is I'm going to make an argument about whether the Belmont principles solve all of the ethical issues in human subjects research. And the general argument is going to be, it's complicated, that sometimes the Belmont principles on a plain read pretty much resolve the research ethics issues, but that this isn't always the case. First of all, because since they are from different ethical traditions with different visions of what morality is, the Belmont principles do not always imply the same answer. Sometimes they are in tension with each other. Secondly, that since the publication of the Belmont Report, now nearly 45 years ago, there are new or controversial questions about how you might apply the Belmont principles because of social changes which have taken place. And I'm also going to make the same sort of argument, in particular, when the application of the principles are affected by changes in the research enterprise itself, which ask us different questions for which, even if it is relevant to take into consideration one or more of the Belmont principles, you have to think about interpreting it in a different way. Certainly, I want to say, don't throw them out. First of all, because, the reason for thinking about throwing them out would be one which we philosophers tend to like, which is if there's a fundamental inconsistency in a particular theory, philosophers tend to think that there must be something wrong with the view. That's a good thing for philosophers to consider, but I think it's also possible to say that it may well be that each of these ethical traditions didn't get it entirely right. And so paying attention to each one of the principles and the assumptions that they make about the nature of morality are all things that we ought to take into consideration to some degree when we try to decide what the right answer is. Secondly, I think it's a valuable thing to think about, because even if you happen to be someone who is particularly committed to one of these principles as being the most important one, sooner or later you're going to encounter someone who is an advocate of one of the other principles. And in order to understand the value of their perspective, it's useful to think about the tradition from which the principle that they think is most important comes from. Okay, so here we go. In some cases, the Belmont principles resolve everything, right? In the case of the syphilis study, all three principles would say it was an unethical study. But it is also fairly frequently the case that a research study can be one in which consent is sought, the risks are slim, the benefits look significant, and subjects are going to be selected equitably. And so on all three counts, a research study doesn't have a real challenge. But let me talk about a couple of situations where the Belmont principles tug us in two different directions. So one is where the respect for persons and beneficence principles are applied in large-scale standard of care comparative effectiveness studies, where you're comparing two different existing standards of care to find out which one of those is better. There are a lot of comparative effectiveness studies that people want to do, and they need relatively large samples. And there are many people who want to argue that we should waive informed consent of the subjects for these studies. First of all, because it costs a considerable amount of money to go through the process of obtaining consent from a large number of prospective participants. And secondly, because there's a scientific validity issue, which is that if there's some difference between those who decline to participate in the study and those who agree to participate in the study, then the generalizability of the results is thrown into question, because it may be that the results of the study don't apply to the people who decline to participate. So this then raises the ethical question of how much risk is it ethical to expose someone to in a research study without their consent. And in the regulations, we have an arbitrary limit at the notion of minimal risk, but this is indeed a kind of line drawing for which it is hard to say exactly why it is that it's that level of risk that we're willing to permit and no more. And for these kinds of studies in this debate, it's often been raised that because people are the beneficiaries of successful treatments developed in earlier studies, that this asks the question of whether people have an obligation to participate in research, which would mean that you would be entitled to assign people to participate in research studies, which puts respect for persons, of course, at odds with beneficence. Now, it's important to note that you could do this in various ways. One way to do this, which would give greater leeway or weight to the principle of respect for persons, would be to say that even if it's true that people have an obligation to participate in research, they should get to choose which study it is that they agree to participate in. And then another area where we look at justice and beneficence as potentially being at odds with each other is in the research efforts which are designed to try to address health disparities between different populations in our society. So let me try to illustrate this for you by looking at a table. This is a table of the leading causes of death from 2020 by race and sex of people who are between the ages of 20 and 24. Accidents, suicide, and homicide are the three leading causes of death in people of this age, right? And I use this illustration because on utilitarian grounds, it would behoove us, arguably, to pay attention to trying to reduce the frequency of deaths in this population, because if we could avoid these people's dying at the ages of 20 to 24, then they might well live for another 6 decades. Whereas when we look at the causes of death of people of my age, even if you could lower the rates of death for people at my age for a particular affliction, I'm not going to live more than another decade or two. And so on utilitarian grounds, figuring out research interventions which prevent the occurrence of death for people at this age would create a much arguably a much bigger payoff. But another thing that I want to draw your attention to is that there's real variation in these numbers depending on your gender or your race. And this suggests that what it is that causes someone of one gender or another, or one race or another, to die in an accident, to kill themselves, or to die in a homicide may vary by race and gender, right? So in particular, look at the rate of death by accident for the American Indian male, right? Which is something like 17 times the rate of death for Asian females. Look at the rate of death by homicide for Black males, right? Which is nearly 50 times higher than it is for white females. If you are interested in developing a research intervention that is specific to what leads to the death of 20 to 24-year-olds, you may well be having to choose which population it is that you want to focus on, because you want to tailor the design of your research intervention to the personal situation of members of that particular group. And another piece of the gloss that one can derive from looking at this table overall, which is sort of interesting, is to notice that across these various groups by race and ethnicity, men die at much higher rates than women. So if you're looking at the question of what is fairer in trying to eliminate health disparities that are created on the basis of discrimination, notice that if you do achieve success, right, in one of the larger groups, you're going to be doing something which benefits the male population, right? Whereas if you want to focus on those things which lead to the deaths of women in these various groups, because you believe that women and not men have been the object of historical discrimination, right? Then the number of people that you're going to manage to change the lives of is likely to be smaller. So there's a number of features of the trade-offs between issues pertaining to research interventions having to do with various kinds of health disparities. So now let's look at a number of instances of social change which lead to new or controversial questions. What I have been talking to you about already in health disparities is something that has gotten more attention in the last couple of years because of the Black Lives Matter movement. The current administration has certainly featured issues pertaining to health disparities quite prominently as a function of the Black Lives Matter movement and the COVID-19 pandemic, which led us to recognize the impact of COVID was differential with respect to mortality in different social groups. And the COVID-19 pandemic, I think, also creates some other ethical challenges for us in trying to apply the Belmont principles. When the pandemic struck, there was certainly the question of whether people had an obligation to participate in research studies for both diagnosis and treatment of COVID. And furthermore, it raised the question of whether there's a limit to the level of risk exposure in research, even with informed consent. In England, in particular, there was a real debate about if you got people to consent to participate in research, could you deliberately expose them to COVID-19 that might kill them in a circumstance where there was not yet an effective treatment, right? Are we willing to put people at risk in that kind of circumstance? Then the last two items, Dobbs versus Jackson, Women's Health Organization, and LePage versus the Center for Reproductive Medicine, those decisions obviously have changed the morals or the legal status anyway of pregnant women's fetuses in the first case and of frozen embryos in the LePage decision that was rendered just recently in the state of Alabama about frozen embryos being used for in vitro fertilization. Is, to just take the last case, is a frozen embryo a human subject such that you have to consider its welfare, or is it not, or is it like just a regular blood sample, which doesn't deserve the kind of treatment that a rational being does? So that example and the one in Dobbs are just two examples of a whole long list of different categories of social groups for whom you might want to make an argument that strict equality is not necessarily the appropriate way to treat subjects who participate in research, both in terms of the way they are treated as subjects in research studies and in terms of decisions that are made by the research enterprise about what groups ought to become the subjects of research studies, because there's a special argument about trying to develop mechanisms for improving the welfare of the members of those groups. Let me give you an example of a concrete example of one of these groups. In about 15 years ago, the Havasupai in Arizona, who live at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, deliberately asked researchers to help them with the problem of diabetes among the Havasupai. This involved taking information from them and also biospecimens. But what they didn't know was that the leftover biospecimens and the data were then repurposed to study a number of other features of the Havasupai, including to look at mental disease in the tribe and to study their geographical ancestry. Once they found out about this, they objected that the studies were potentially stigmatizing and inconsistent with their traditional beliefs. And in this instance, their interests triumphed. The studies were stopped and the biospecimens were returned to the Havasupai. So this is a matter not so much of what I would call distributive justice, as we see evident in the application of the Belmont principles in the Belmont Report, but rather a matter of procedural justice, of whether a group has some kind of entitlement to participate in decisions about whether research about them should be ongoing. Now, it's important, I think, to recognize that there are arguments to be made on both sides of this controversy. Certainly, one can understand how it might be stigmatizing to this group if it turned out that mental disease were particularly pervasive of a particular kind within this group. On the other hand, of course, one could argue that without knowing enough about the kind of mental diseases that are particular to this group, you're handicapped in your ability to develop effective ways of intervening to improve the mental health of the members of this group. So it's a dilemma. So now let's look at a parallel kind of case where I think we might have different opinions about the notion of control by the social group. Related to the Black Lives Matter movement, people had the thought that perhaps in trying to address racial prejudice in our society, it seemed natural to point or turn to the public education system to see whether educational efforts by teachers to try to eliminate racial bias might be a powerful solution to the problem of racial prejudice in the United States. And a bunch of educational researchers analyzed data from two existing national data sets. And their finding was perhaps in a way disappointing. They found that teachers, just as well as non-teachers, hold pro-white implicit and explicit racial biases. And there really isn't much of a difference between the two. Again, we could say that arguably this is stigmatizing to teachers to reveal this finding about teachers being no better than the rest of us. But the notion that teachers ought to have a say in whether these kinds of findings are sought, I think is an argument that's more difficult to make than in the case of the Havasupai. So now I want to talk about changes in the research landscape itself, right? We all recognize, I think, that in various ways, technology is drastically changing our world. If you want to make a phone call, you use your cell phone. You don't have to go into a phone booth. If you want to find romance, you don't need to go to a bar anymore. You can go online to an app and check out possible dates. If you want to understand mental disease, you no longer often are asked to lie on a couch and say whatever comes to mind, but rather you are put into a machine which studies the electronic activity of your brain. And I think there is an important point to be made about technology in general, which does apply in the circumstance of research. But I first want to make this point In another context, a point that was made by a 20th century philosopher by the name of Hannah Arendt. Arendt looked at the technology of violence, and she made two related points about the invention of technology such as the AR-15s that you're looking at here, which is that in general, technology may very greatly amplify the effects of human action. She pointed out the contrast between the level of physical effort that it would take you to kill one person with your bare hands compared to the ability to use an AR-15 to kill dozens of people in a minute's time. And in addition to amplifying the consequences, the repercussions of actions, the other thing that technology tends to do is to hide from us an appreciation for all of those consequences of what we do, because we don't necessarily see them with our unaided physical senses because of the way in which the technology works. So let me turn to the research context to illustrate this idea. When you send a message to one person, you no longer send it in a letter, which would physically have to be traded from one person to the next in order for another person to see that letter's contents. Now, somebody can forward it to their listserv, and it can become available to hundreds of people in an instant. The same thing is true with where that information goes. These huge companies are built on the premise that they collect and distribute information about you to people you are completely unaware of for the purposes of figuring out ways of making money. But in the process, that information about you moves around to a wealth of people of whom you are unaware. And the technology for storing that information has dramatically changed, such that rather having to look through boxes and boxes in a warehouse to find records, all you have to do is sit at your computer and draw that information from those servers in order to reach those results, which means that information about us is used by researchers through technology in ways that we no longer directly observe. And there is, of course, the question of what say do we still have over the uses to which that information is put. And then lastly, there's artificial intelligence. And as these two quotes, I think, illustrate, there are a lot of people who are doing a great deal of hand-wringing about what the potential consequences of the uses of artificial intelligence might be, both in terms of the way in which data are used to draw conclusions about questions which then inform policy, and about what interventions artificial intelligence might actually produce, which may have an impact on human beings. And I think that this emphasizes a set of questions which we have heard before, right? But are magnified, I think, by artificial intelligence and ChatGPT, which is the question of, in the uses of these technologies, there are several different steps. And the question becomes, to what extent are the various players in the development and use of this technology responsible for the end result? Is it the producer of the technology, or the person who actually uses it, or the people who, or the regulators of that technology? Or is it, to what extent is the society that permits the existence and use of that technology responsible for the consequences? Here is an example from about 60 years ago of one famous instance of this. There was a guy named Ralph Nader who discovered that an automobile called the Corvair was designed in such a way that it was unstable and likely to create more crashes than they could have prevented had they designed the car differently. And they went ahead and built them and sold them anyway, until Nader came along and caused a fracas. So that is the end of my prepared remarks. So I think we're ready, or at least I'm hoping that I'm ready to try to answer any questions that you might have about what I've said or what I haven't.
Thank you for that, Ivor. Hopefully you've shown us all why we shouldn't throw you overboard in an overloaded sinking ship scenario. There have indeed been quite a number of questions submitted by the audience. And I'm going to start with the more general ones. Specifically, one audience member remarks that just as ICH E6 has undergone updates to address what should be considered good clinical practice, should the Belmont Report be updated or revised to more appropriately address current ethical issues? And in a similar nature, another audience member remarks that there have been calls for a Belmont 2.0 or amendments to the report to account for scientific and societal changes. Should these calls be answered? And if so, how?
I guess my general reaction, I think, is twofold, and it's really two pieces of the same thing in a way. The Belmont Report, as the slides indicated to some extent, the Belmont Report has two sections for each principle. There's the description of the principle itself, and then there's the application of the principle. And what I would be inclined to do, I think, would be first to turn to the applications, because I think that as I've tried to suggest here, I think there are additional features to the application of those principles that are worth, that would be worth adding, if you will. And that's, I think, also, because the other piece is I have tried to illustrate that you don't get straight from the Belmont principle to the answer about the right thing to do without anything in between. There are other considerations that you have to face in order to make the decision about the right thing to do. You know, take the case of the Havasupai, right? I think you could, that the notion of procedural justice, I suppose you could make that into a separate principle with a sort of, particularly in the United States, we see an emphasis on democratic decision-making and community decision-making so that you could formulate it into a different standalone principle of its own. But I don't think that you necessarily have to put it there in order to put it somewhere in the applications. I think that you could leave the principle of justice alone, if you will, but expand it where it comes to the applications.
There are similar questions coming in asking if you need a separate report to address things like emerging technologies such as generative AI. So not an update to the Belmont report, but perhaps another report that really looks at societal changes and technological advances.
I guess I think my answer would be a little on the arbitrary side, that, you know, there are various ways of dividing up the research landscape to either group or separate related research ethics issues. And, you know, whether you want to take a particular one or not as the best way to organize the issues, you know, I think it doesn't, that there are arguments to be made on either side. You know, I see that somewhere in the chat, I think I saw something about how it is the case that that the Belmont report, of course, grew out of directions from the National Commission. And, you know, I should also note, if I didn't say this, that, you know, the National Research Act also was the source of the instruction to the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare that they had to issue regulations. And the current regulations do, in fact, as I did indicate, reflect those principles. So I think you might then have to think about the notion that if you buy an argument for fundamentally changing the Belmont report, at the same time, you ought to be asking the question of whether there ought to be parallel regulatory reform.
There's actually a question, a historical question, which is, why was it named Belmont? What is the origin of the name?
The origin of the name is a reference to a house where the National Commission met a number of times during its deliberations. It's out close to Dulles Airport, as a matter of fact.
And again, another historical inquiry, were there ethical principles that were considered by the commission, but then ultimately rejected?
There were, and there is a literature about this. I know that I think Al Johnson was one of the members of the commission who played an active role. I think at one point they were up to about 7 principles, and he pushed hard to try to get the other members of the commission to narrow it down, because he thought that the report would have more punch. But there is a literature. I would encourage you, among other sources, to look at our archive of interviews of some of the members of the commission and the commission staff that are somewhere on our website to get further direct anecdotal information about how they got to where they were.
They are under the policy and regulations tab of our website, I believe, and maybe one of our colleagues could put the direct link into the chat. Not to put you on the spot, but another audience member writes, I realize that this presentation is not necessarily about the regulations, but you mentioned big data, which appears to call some question, which appears to put exemption 4 into some question. Do you care to remark on that?
I think that it certainly means that exemption 4 is now going to be used much more frequently than it had been. I think it raises, particularly for me, what it raises is an issue which I understand there is a difference in the general European perspective compared to ours about who has how much control over their data, and whether you can insist that your data be forgotten. The other piece of this that I think is really important is that while there's been a great deal of attention, and there has been, there is a regulatory provision which also has to do with our reconsideration of what identifiable private information is. There's been a lot of attention paid to the technology of re-identifying data. I think it's also important for us to think more seriously about what we consider to be private information and what is not.
Thank you. When you were talking about respect for persons, an audience member said, in research that employs deception, there is often pushback from researchers to disclose the deception after the completion of the deceptive research procedures. From the perspective of the Belmont ethical principles, what can IRBs or HRPPs say to do or to counter this pushback?
I think that there is a provision in the regulation that says that if you waive consent, that as appropriate, information about the research will be provided to the participants after participation. And as with the arguments about the cost and potential validity threat of informed consent, some researchers are concerned about, for example, if you debrief some subjects and the study isn't over, that they will inform others about what the research study was about and invalidate the study. I think this is an issue where we can talk about ethical responsibilities on the part of both researchers and participants. One thing that the researchers can do is they can delay when they do the debriefing, rather than just saying, I don't want to debrief them, because if I debrief them right away, they'll invalidate the study. I think it's also an interesting issue here that I think one could make an argument that research subjects themselves have an obligation, if they have been debriefed, not to disclose what they've learned to other potential subjects.
Thank you. When you were discussing the Havasupai tribe research, an audience member wrote to ask if the data was completely de-identified prior to the start of the secondary research studies. And similarly, another audience member wrote to ask if that was indeed the case, if those secondary studies were considered to be eligible for exemption from the common rule regulatory requirements, or if they actually received the determination of being not human subjects research.
Yeah, I can't answer the regulatory question, because I don't know what the IRBs decided to do. What I do know is that while I don't know whether the specific individual identities of the subjects were taken off, if you will, they were all still identified as being specimens and data of the Havasupai, because the people who were doing the research, the other research studies, did want to know that they were studying in particular mental disease within this tribe, and whether and they wanted to study what the ancestral origins were. I suspect, but I don't know for sure, whether the individual identities were on the biospecimens, because I know that another reason why the Havasupai wanted the specimens back is that they had a belief that all of your physical remains need to be buried in order for you to progress in the afterlife. And so what they did do when the specimens were returned was to take them to the graveyard so that they could be reunited. But I don't know for a fact whether they knew which biospecimen belonged to which individual decedent.
Someone did just write in the chat that some of the blood samples did have the name of the subject on the label. So that's helpful. Okay, there was another question. It reads, the COVID pandemic brought up many questions about what is research versus what is public health practice or surveillance activities. This is something that a public health agency, IRB, struggles with quite a bit. Do you have any philosophical perspective on the difference between the two?
Between public health surveillance and research?
Yes.
I do. I think that this is an interesting question insofar as there are a lot of people in the academic and public and policy community who distinguish between research ethics and public health ethics. And they often draw the distinction by saying that the focus of research ethics is on the individual human subject, whereas in public health, the object to be treated appropriately, if you will, is the community, right? And so public health surveillance, in order to identify and then make decisions about how the community ought to be treated, does seem to me to be a question about the treatment of groups versus individuals, which is at least a useful conceptual distinction to think about.
And on the question of scope, someone asks, how do you think that the replicability crisis in various fields that are related to human subjects research relate to the Belmont principles? Who is ultimately responsible for ensuring the quality of research?
I think the easy and obvious answer is the whole crowd. The sponsors of research, the investigators themselves, even the subjects themselves, and I guess, replicability in particular is again another question which forces us to have to ask a question about whether the design of a study that is more likely to be replicable is also one that costs more. And are we, to what extent are we willing to pay more in order for a study's results to be more reliable?
Thank you. Someone is actually saying that this question of replicability is a great topic for another webinar. So thank you for giving us that idea. Perhaps we could pick it up with our colleagues. I think we're at time, but I just have one additional question, maybe to tie us all together. When you were talking about balancing the Belmont principles, someone asked, how do we try to balance the principles most equitably when they are in conflict without just going with the loudest voice in the room?
Well, I think it is, I'll say first of all that I think it is the case that rather than loudest, I think it is true that in some instances, the argument to be made for one principle in a particular context is much more compelling, that it's much more a matter of respect in this case than it is of beneficence, right? Etc. Right? That's the, that's the positive answer. I'm afraid that I also have to acknowledge that I believe that there is not a single neutral referee to whom the advocates of the three principles can appeal to say which of the principles ought to trump the other two. That's because, again, I'll say this as a personal matter, I don't believe American society has a fully coherent moral perspective. We are put together from disparate fragments.
Well, and on that note, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Ivor. This was a wonderful presentation. Many of you have asked about the slides and the recording of this event. Both will be available on our website in due time. And if there are any questions that you have not received an answer to, please feel free to email us at ohrp@hhs.gov. Thank you all so much.
Thank you all for your time.